Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for responding. First, we have the American dream. For decades, it provided hope to millions of people around the world for a better life, better access to education, better jobs. Then we have the Chinese dream. They say, unlike the American dream, it focuses on the I and the me. The Chinese dream is about the collective we. And the Chinese dream has helped to get 800 million people out of poverty. And now we're talking about the Asian dream. Where does it get its inspiration from? And must the Asian dream be in the context of the American dream? And is the Asian dream at risk now that we have greater inequality, income disparity? I'm really excited to have a very diverse panel of speakers today. Helen Clark, Ho Kwang Peng, Kishore Mahbubani, Chatri Sidyotong, thank you for joining us this morning. Now, first, let's define what the Asian dream is. Is it about economic mobility? I want to pick on Kishore first because a few days ago, he called me up and said, Haslina, I just have one question. What is this Asian dream? And I said, I'm just supposed to be telling me. So 3-4 days on, Kishore, I think you've thought about it. How do you define the Asian dream?
Thank you. I would say that at stage one, all dreams are the same. I say stage one because I actually have lived through stage one. When I was young, I was brought up in a poor family, in a poor neighborhood, in a poor Singapore, where at the age of 6, I was put on a special feeding program because I was undernourished. Now I'm overnourished. And I remember, if you ask me what's the most significant sort of step I took in my life where I felt that I crossed a major boundary up was when my house had a flush toilet. I can tell you, if you live in a house where a pail sits there for 24 hours collecting human waste every day and is removed the next day, and then it disappears and a flush toilet comes, the quality of your life improves dramatically. Now, if you can imagine an Asia with billions of flush toilets all over, where people feel the sense of human dignity has improved from basic sort of subsistence, sustenance, towards a life where they can dream and do other things, that I would say is stage one. And that's the biggest story of human history, because in the last 30 years, Asia has lifted more people out of absolute poverty than any other human society or than any other time of history. So in the last 30 years, we have actually carried billions of people over what I call the minimal threshold of survival towards beginning to do other things. And that's why the Asian dream, to put it very bluntly, is the biggest dream in the world.
Yeah, but I would say that's all. I find it true. I agree with it. But I think it doesn't make for good publicity when somebody else reports that the Americans have their great American dream and the Asian dream is for everybody to have flush toilets. I think one of the problems I have, and I think I was somewhat misquoted in the video, is the idea that America has, again, usurped what is a universal concept, and there's a certain danger of ethnocentrism. I would actually recommend that the Milken Institute have a Milken Institute for the advancement of national dreams. The advancement of the American dream into the rest of the world seems to predicate that the American dream was the source of all dreams. And as you've said, stage one, the more Asians have had their dreams all along, to be uplifted from poverty, to be able to feel pride after centuries of humiliation under colonialism. These are all parts of our dream. And I'm not quite sure I understand what it means to redefine the Asian dream, nor to even say that the American dream is the source of American soft power around the world. That to me is quite a lot of mythology. All of us have our dreams. The American dream is a very valid one, rooted in its own history, but it's not as if to say that Asians haven't had their dreams all along. And I think that's a fundamental point we should try to be aware of that we should not be looking at an American model and how can that be adapted to Asian dreams. We should look at it today, especially in the world when America is no longer the single dominant power, nor will it be for the next century. We should look at every single country in the world and say, what are your own national dreams rooted, very much rooted in your own history, tradition, and civilization, rather than in America's own very unique history of an immigrant society rooted in individualism, going out west, forming your own future, and so on. A lot of Asian societies don't have that background, and we have to create our own dreams rooted in what we've had for centuries, rather than to take the American model and say, adapt it to Asia.
And Chatri, you lived the American dream. You saw the opportunities in the US. I mean, how do you view the Asian dream, whether or not it is within the context of the American dream, which is what KP is taking issue with?
So I grew up in Thailand for 18 years, and then I spent 18 years in America studying and working there, and actually being an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. So I would respectfully disagree with KP, even though I have the utmost respect for him as a legendary entrepreneur in Asia. But the reality is, the American dream, you know, America overtook Europe, if you look back history, because of a single fact of innovation and immigrant openness and allowing people to literally flourish without being part of the old boys network. Now, of course, there is an old boys network in every country, but in Asia, when I grew up, there was no way that you could go from being a poor person to be a rich person. It was impossible. It was stratified, meaning if you were born rich, you were going to be rich because you got the best access to everything. If you're born poor, it didn't matter if you went to the best university in Thailand, Chula, you would still be poor or you would still be middle class. There's no escaping. Now today, the Asian dream is totally redefined. Because of the capital markets, there's a venture capital community now thriving in Southeast Asia, in China, and suddenly the era of intellectual property businesses, meaning technology and media, suddenly open up doors where you can have incredible stories like Tokopedia, where William was a lower middle class person and now skyrocketing. You never saw those stories in Asian history, and for the first time, we really are seeing innovation taking charge and the capital markets accepting that, very much like the American dream. So, I was an immigrant going to America. I graduated from school and I went to Silicon Valley and I got funded by venture capitalists. And that is the American dream,
Can
right?
I respond to that? I know you didn't.
I'll let Helen go first, okay? They say fortune favors the bold, right? It doesn't matter whether it's an American, a Singaporean, an Asian, or whatever it is. Fair?
Well, I'm not American and I'm not from Asia, so I'm going to bring a different perspective to the discussion.
You've been caught in the middle.
And I'm going to strongly agree that dreams have a context, right? And they're not ahistorical. They come out of the experiences of our specific societies. I think of my grandparents and what they lived through. World War I, they were young adults, and 3 of the 4 of them lost siblings. That was followed by a very significant depression in the early 1920s, which they had to get through. One grandfather walked off a farm. He couldn't make it. Then along came the Great Depression of the 30s, so that same grandfather was in a work camp. And then came World War II, when their kids were called up, my parents' generation. So I look at what I was born into, and it was against that background that people wanted peace and security. They didn't want to see their sons and daughters killed again, and they created a very secure life for us, where we as baby boomers felt we could achieve anything that we wanted to achieve. So that's kind of the way the Kiwi dream developed. But it was interesting to hear the American dream kind of almost defined as the immigrant dream, because there is that whole kind of mantra about Ellis Island and the poor and hungry and being able to make it. Well, now they're running into Trump's wall. It's not so easy, is it? So the American dream and what it stands for, I think, is under constant redefinition as well.
Can I respond to Chatri? You wouldn't want to respond too forcefully. You might take me on as a martial artist. But I think I don't disagree at all with the idea of the American dream itself. I mean, many people have lived it, and I think Chatri has lived it because as a young Thai person without opportunities, he found that opportunity in the US. What I meant, though, was that what's happening in Asia today, particularly in ASEAN countries and in China, is not a result of the American dream finally propagating itself to Asia. It's a function of economic growth. It's a function of the fact that finally in ASEAN, you've got 600 over million people achieving a certain level of economic takeoff where entrepreneurship can now thrive. And there are thousands and thousands of young people like yourself, whether it be from Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, or China, who have never heard of the American dream, who have never gone to America, and yet they are achieving it because of the fundamental economic conditions of a middle class driven by young people and consumerism now allowing entrepreneurship. That's not at all to try to put down the American dream. All I'm saying is that I don't think that we should have another case of American exceptionalism where the American dream, if transplanted to other countries, then those countries can thrive. Every country has its own dream. America had its dream, and good for it, and better for it. But the rest of us in Asia have our own dreams too, and we do not need to tick off what are the elements of the American dream in order for us to say that we then have a valid dream. And if we don't tick off those same points as what made up the American dream, then we don't have a dream. That's my only point.
May I
Can I
Kishore goes first. He
okay,
raises
now,
his
can I
hand.
disagree, both of them? I mean, I agree with Chatri that yes, there is, I mean, frankly, as growing up as a child in Singapore, after we got a little bit of affluence and I got a TV set in Singapore and we could see, you know, my three sons and all that, you could see the idyllic American dream, even in your home in Singapore. But I think it's important to inject data into here. You spoke about how successful the immigrants have been in America in the last 30, 40 years. That's an amazing story. In the same period, America is the only major developed society where the average income of the bottom 50%, 50%, has gone down over a 30-year period. This is the betrayal of the American dream to 50% of the population, which I think is equally real and has to be dealt with and to balance the picture about the American dream. Now, Gong Ping, on Asia, I think you make too light of the huge achievement when you take people out of absolute poverty. Because if you don't take people, if you've been to slums, in Calcutta and Mumbai, and I've been to the slums and I walk through them and see how the people just struggling to find enough food, right? And if you don't take people out of that basic condition, which is the big story in Asia, rescuing more than 1 billion, 1.5 billion people out of absolute poverty, that's the big story. And then we can go on to the stage 2, and the remarkable thing, and this is what the real story of humanity is all about, because if you look at how long the Western societies took, from the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution to middle class, it's about 150 years, right? Asians are compressing history and now doing a 150-year journey in 30 years. That's what's remarkable about Asia, the pace of growth. But the next stage for Asia is going to be very difficult, because then you've got to define what is it you're struggling to achieve when you make it to a basic kind of life. What else are you going to deliver? And I think that's what makes Asia so interesting, because we are going from stage 1 to stage 2 and stage 3, and that's why the Asian dream is the biggest dream.
Chatri, you wanted to respond.
No, so when I was talking, I didn't say that, that Asia is copying the American dream. But philosophically, when I was in America, there was a sense of genuine hope. I mean, not today necessarily, but I'm saying when I was there 25 years ago, et cetera, there was a sense of optimism, hope that was infused in all ranks of society. Okay, and genuinely, you really felt like if you're middle class, if you studied hard, you could go and do something, and you could start a company and be something and do whatever you want to do and make an impact on society. Asia, I can tell you, when I grew up, there was no hope in terms of, because there was such a stratified society. It was rich people always, their kids became richer and they inherited the companies. If you were poor, middle class, there's no way you move up. So if you just take like India, back, before this whole tech boom, the best, or 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the best job was get a government job or go to Schlumberger, get a good education and go to Schlumberger. And that was only for the very, very, very best. Otherwise, you'd be static and stuck. But today, look at India, look at Southeast Asia, because of the capital markets, because of the culture of meritocracy that's being born. And I think we did learn something from America. I do believe that. So I'm not saying that, you know, we're copying the American dream, but there are concepts that made America at one point the greatest country in the world in 200 years, right? It overtook Europe, it overtook the rest of the world because of this culture of innovation and culture of meritocracy. So that is what I think Asia has now brought here with China, Asia, ASEAN, or India. So I think that the Asian dream is very much alive. Suddenly you have these stories of, I'll go back to Tokopedia, where, you know, a lower middle class guy can now become a mega, you know, entrepreneur at a very large scale in Indonesia. That would never have happened. Never have happened in my era when I grew up in Thailand.
I think there's a fundamental difference here, though, when you define a dream. And this is where I think we are borrowing some of the language of and the mythology of the American dream and applying it to society, which does not necessarily need to or should have that same sort of dream. And to this point, Kishore, you and I not generally disagree, but here I totally agree with Kishore that the American dream is a highly individualistic dream, which is very valid for America's own historical background. But it's always about the rags to riches person. It's about the individual becoming the great entrepreneur, as you've pointed out. Whereas, as Kishore has very rightly said, the fact that for the last 50 over years, when Asia and China and India and other poor societies in Asia were lifted out of absolute poverty, which is probably the greatest economic achievement of humankind, if you went and asked a poor Indian farmer or a Chinese person who's never sent a kid to high school or to university, and you asked them, what is your dream? They wouldn't have been able to enunciate it in terms that could be framed as the American dream is framed today. But that is not to say that that is not the greatest achievement, nor is it to say that simply because it's not been enunciated, the Chinese and the Indians, and even for you, Chatri, the millions of young Thai people from the Isan area of northeast Thailand that were able not to become famous entrepreneurs, but to finally be able to afford the little things, as you use as an example, flush toilet and so on, but to be able to finally achieve some degree of economic upliftment. That has been the Asian dream for the last 50 years. And we don't have to have it become an individualistic, entrepreneurial dream to then state only then is there a dream.
I think another issue will be whether in the journey that Asia's on, whether it will start to run into the significant inequality blockages in the United States, which Kishore rightly referred to of incomes being static. So there's been this incredible growth and movement, but will aspirations end up being blunted again if the tide doesn't continue to lift everyone to, you know, to have that opportunity?
Just to bring stats into this discussion, you talked about needing stats and inequality. We have perhaps, 1% of the population, the top 1% of the population in India, in Thailand, holding 80 to 90% of the wealth. And Asia currently, 5 cities in Asia are currently among the top 10 when it comes to, you know, millionaires minted. So what's the risk that the Asian dream may be slipping away from a lot of the people here?
Yeah. Well, I think there's an American philosopher, John Rawls, who's probably the greatest recent political philosopher in America, and he said, the issue is not inequality, the issue is how the inequality affects the bottom 10%. So in some societies where there's rising inequality, the bottom 10% goes down. And that's what's happened in America in the last 30 years. China also has had lots of inequality growing in the last 30 years, but the bottom 10% has been going up. So that's the critical variable. It's not about whether or not there's more or less inequality, it's whether or not the rising inequality is benefiting all segments of that society.
It's also partly
I think
about,
that's the critical
about whether you
measure.
have safety nets in place where no one's going to fall below a decent living. I mean, you take, you know, the very advanced welfare societies of Scandinavia. It's not to say that some aren't poor relative to others, but the line is set so you don't fall below that.
What you just pointed out is actually a very good thing. I think we should move beyond the idea of what is an American and Asian dream and actually talk about more, whatever the Asian dream is, what might stymie the aspirations of Asians for their own dreams. And I think a very good example is today in Hong Kong. Despite what people may say about the CIA funding some people and the Chinese government funding other provocateurs, you can see that the whole world has been caught by surprise. Even people like myself who have lived in Hong Kong for several years and been going to Hong Kong every year, and I have many Hong Kong friends and so on. I think we're all caught by surprise that the Hong Kong dream, whatever that might be, of the average Hong Kong person, for even the minimum living standards, has been totally blocked. And that's what you now get in Hong Kong. And this challenge to normal young people being able to afford the simple joys of life, having a house, getting married, having a good prospect, that is essentially the dream of anyone. And if that dream cannot be fulfilled, whether it be in Hong Kong or more dangerously in China, then I think we will see real dangers to the whole economic and social development of Asia.
That gap in Hong Kong, by the way, is the widest in 45 years, Kishore.
Yeah, I was in Hong Kong for a few days 2 weeks ago. And like Kong Peng, I'm also quite shocked by what happened in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong seemed like a success story all the way. But when I got there, I sort of, in some ways, discovered one of the root causes of the problems. When C.H. Tung became the chief executive in 1997, one of the first things he wanted to do, he put up a plan to build 85,000 units of public housing per year. And if he had succeeded in that plan 20 years ago, he would have had 1.7 million units of public housing built in the last 20 years. He was blocked, unfortunately, by a few extremely wealthy Hong Kong tycoons who were concerned about their land banks and so on and so forth. So that was a strategic mistake made by these Hong Kong tycoons, because by failing to, and this is my key point, by failing to improve the living standards of the bottom 10%, you end up getting this story. And one of the points I make is that if you look at the last 30 years, the bottom 50%, let's say in Hong Kong, has been going down, the bottom 15% in China is going up. And that's a fundamental difference. And that's why, by the way, I want to inject one other point, by the way, very quickly. We should not just focus on the past 30 years, because I think the next 30 years are going to be very challenging for Asia in other dimensions. Because one of the sad parts is that as countries become more developed and more muscular, they also begin to expand their geopolitical space. And for me, the big challenge in the next 30 years in Asia is making sure that as these Asian countries become more muscular, they don't end up squabbling or, worst case, fighting each other, which is why, by the way, what's happened, for example, it's quite shocking to see how two of the most developed countries in Asia, two of the few members of OECD in Asia, South Korea and Japan, suddenly have got themselves locked into a downward spiral from which they cannot get out of. Now, that's the reverse of the Asian dream. If that's what happens when you become more developed, then we have a problem in Asia.
I think it's interesting, our discussion is pointing us to reflect on the fact that what often looked like political demands and crises have an economic root, and you've absolutely put your finger on it. The aspirations of Hong Kong youth, can they ever make it? Can they ever have a home? And I'm minded, and I don't want to draw a parallel on this, but if you look at the protests which started the so-called Arab Spring, which quickly became a winter, it was the Tunisian street seller who burned himself to death because of lack of opportunity, but there was no one who would listen to him. And out of the economic distress of the youth and the unemployed and the marginalised was the sort of single, spark that lit the prairie fire, to use a regional phrase here. So what looked like demands for political voice come out of this sort of frustration and anger that things aren't working here for me, and I need to be able to express this. And I think we're very much seeing that in Hong Kong.
But by the same token, I think if we were to look at the elephant in the room today, it's not Hong Kong, it's China. And I think that's why I wanted to say earlier about the danger of extrapolating the American dream to Asia. And that is, if you were to look at the American dream, you would think that if China were to be able to achieve the Chinese dream, It should have sufficient market reforms to allow entrepreneurs to come up and so on and so forth. That's all fine and good. But I think the Chinese government actually understands China perhaps somewhat better. And the current anti-corruption drive, which no doubt is quite conveniently going to capture people who are opponents of Xi Jinping also, but at its fundamental basis, the biggest obstacle to the Chinese achieving the Chinese dream is corruption at the local level. Simply because there is no structural democracy, and China has had 5,000 years of no structural democracy, but of a history where a corrupt dynasty is overthrown by another general because the previous dynasty has lost its mandate to govern because of corruption. And the problem in China today is that there is such a massive corruption at the local level, so that even small farmers have had their land taken away by corrupt officials and resold for development at a huge profit by developers and so on. You're only reading about the corruption at the highest levels of government, but it permeates the entire society. And I think the Chinese government is well aware that if they do not end the corruption that is so endemic in China today, there will be chaos like in Hong Kong. And that's what I think the rest of the world and America should look at, not whether there's sufficient market reforms. That is fine and good, but that's not as fundamental to Chinese society being stable and Chinese people being able to achieve their dreams than the eradication of corruption.
I want to bring up a point that Chatri brought up about how technology has helped lift millions out of poverty, yet technology is developing at such a rapid pace that now we're talking about how AI may eventually destroy the jobs of the poor. When it comes to manufacturing in particular, we're talking about countries like India, like Indonesia. What happens then to the Asian dream?
Well, I take the view that every single industrial revolution had all the naysayers saying the end is nigh. You know, where are the jobs? When the hand loom was replaced by the spinning jenny replaced by the industrial mills, when the computer age came with the huge mainframes that took up almost a building in the 60s and 70s. And human beings are incredibly inventive and adaptable. Given a challenge, we tend to find a way through it. And we forget how much, even in the last decade or so, our lives have changed with technology. New jobs have been invented. I do think it puts a very heavy onus on policymakers to be looking at how to educate young people for this new future, highest possible levels of education, adaptability, entrepreneurship, the best connectivity you can have. But you know, human beings will find a way through it, but let's ensure they've got the tools to do that.
I actually agree with Helen. It's so easy to have the naysayers speak out on technology, but at this stage of development, technology is making a huge difference in Asia. And one of the most interesting statistics is that maybe as recently as 1990, I think India had 0 cell phones. Now it has over 1 billion cell phones. And of the billion, used to be only like 50 million were smartphones. Now it's about 500 million plus smartphones now. So that transformation that does, when you suddenly, in very remote villages in India, through very simple, basic solar power and small satellite connection, they suddenly get access, for example, to Wikipedia. And suddenly any piece of information, even the poorest people, can get access to tremendous sources of information. That's transforming the human condition in a very fundamental way. Because again, people forget that for the past 2,000 years of human history, the people at the bottom just struggled to survive. They never had access to any kind of decent education or any kind of access to the kind of global sources of information. Today we have, in a sense, completely transformed the human condition. We are giving people at the very bottom access to remarkable amounts of information. And I think that's the result of that. I think we got to wait and see, because we've never been done before. You know, so the brains at the bottom 50% that were never used are suddenly being harvested. And I think that process of that harvesting will create new leaps of creativity or productivity, which I think will make the next 30 years very exciting.
KP?
I think that's all fine and good. I'm also not a naysayer, doomsdayer, prophet of doom about technology, but I think if we were to look at the dangers that Asia face, and if we were to be proactive about it, I think the greatest risk about the technology, the fourth industrial revolution and all that, is that not enough Asian societies are spending money on education. Yeah. When you look at, and that's where the gap is going to be felt the most, not between the rich and the poor necessarily, but between those who are tech literate and are able to then really take advantage of technology, and those who are not tech literate. In Singapore, I think we're very fortunate. Education has been a priority of the government. There's even a lot of spending now by schools to have students learn coding early on in life. Rather than learn a foreign language, you might as well learn coding. But if you look at other societies like in Thailand, Indonesia, and so on, the gaps in educational investment are huge. And I think technology here can actually increase the divide between those who are not tech literate and are going to be left behind in increasingly low-skilled, low-cost jobs, and those who are tech literate. And Asian societies have to be, Asian governments have to be really aware that investment in education is one of the key requirements if we are to ever enable the Asian dream to come true.
So Elon Musk is wrong when he says that AI technology will be an existential threat to the human race, Chatri.
Wow.
I don't think so.
That's Elon Musk.
No, I'm much more optimistic about, I agree with everyone here in the panel that humans have an incredible ability to learn and innovate. And I'm very optimistic about Asia's future and the Asian dream because of the fact that we now have a culture of meritocracy and innovation, and governments are promoting it. Just, when I came to Singapore even 10 years ago, there was no such thing as entrepreneurship. There was no such thing as startups. There was no venture capital community, literally nothing. And it only flourished in the last 5 years. And so I'll go back to entrepreneurship because that is really the engine for every economy globally. That is literally the engine. And as long as you invest heavily and promote meritocracy and this sense of hope, hope is the most powerful tool for whether you're poor, middle class, or rich. Hope is the most powerful way for any economy to thrive. And going back to the Hong Kong tycoons, what I didn't like about when I grew up in Thailand was that this is the story. The tycoons would protect their turf. They were not thinking about how do I promote Thailand? How do I make it a better country? It was literally about I inherit this wealth and I'm going to control this wealth. Today, you can just see a shift across all of ASEAN, China, India, where there is a real sense of hope. But at the same time, a lot of first-time entrepreneurs, a lot of first-time rags to riches in Asia have this deep sense of gratitude and responsibility that they were born in this era where their parents may not have had any social mobility, that suddenly they do have social mobility. So I think when I look at the leading entrepreneurs across Asia, I do find them with a sense of responsibility, a sense of gratitude that I didn't see in America. So in America, it's a very individualistic culture. Asia, as KP had noted, is a very community-centric culture and one of harmony. And so I do think that you see a lot of the business leaders, especially the new generation business leaders, have that deep sense of gratitude and that deep sense of responsibility to making this world a better place, which I would say the older generation, and again, I want to name names, but older generation tycoons, they're about how can I get super rich off poor people and never allow poor people to get.
Well, in defense of richer tycoons, I'm not sure that younger tech startup guys are that totally sort of altruistic. I'm not sure they all are. They all talk about it, so that every startup today has to have as its central mission to save the world. Now, how many really live it, I don't know. But with all due respect to Chatri, and I think he's an extremely successful entrepreneur, and we certainly need more entrepreneurs like that in Asia. The exception I take to what you've said is when you said something like when you first came to Singapore 10 years ago, there was no entrepreneurship. That may well be true. It may only have been 5 years ago, etc. But I think, again, the point here is if you take the perspective of the American dream and apply it to Asia, then you would look at state capitalism, for example, and government-led investment as evils. Whereas that is not necessarily so given our own history. As Kishore has said, in India and in China, there has not been until recently entrepreneurship. But that should not at all reduce the the impact of state-led capitalism and state-led investment that for the last 30 years has lifted up billions of people from poverty. So the American dream, if it's related to entrepreneurship, I think it's fine and good. It's a great model for entrepreneurship. But it doesn't mean to say that prior to entrepreneurship coming into Asia, which is relatively new, it's not as if to say previous to that, there hasn't been a huge achievement within Asia and millions and billions of Asians achieving their dream of having either a flush toilet or first time sending their children to university, etc. So the American dream should not be only looked at through an American perspective of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, can I surprise KP by agreeing with him?
I know.
He's not used to this. I actually agree fundamentally what KP just said, because the assumption so far has been that history is a one-way road, right? We start with the American dream, everybody copies the American dream, and the world is better off. But I think now history is going to become a two-way street. So you have, in a sense, one American dream and maybe another Asian dream, and it's conceivable that the American dream has some lessons to learn from the Asian dream. And I think the key point that KP put forward is that in Asia, good governance is a critical variable for development. And in America, as you know, Ronald Reagan famously said, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. So you demolish government and everything will be better off. But I think if America is going to remain competitive, frankly, even though this is a heresy in America, America needs to develop some kind of industrial policy in critical areas of technology, like artificial intelligence, where if the Chinese government is going to put in, I don't know how many $1 billion into developing a solid base of research on artificial intelligence, you cannot say, oh, I'll leave it to the private sector to compete with what the Chinese government is doing. America also needs some kind of industrial policy. And by the way, even though in theory America is opposed to government involvement, many of the key inventions actually came out of the research budget of the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense budget created a lot of the innovations that you see in the American economy. So that's an example of how, when the world is changing a lot, when you talk about the American dream, you may want to ask yourself, now, how do we need to change this dream to fit new realities also?
You know, some say that the American dream is fading. Some say the American dream is dead. Mike Milken says the American dream is unequal. How do we ensure that the Asian dream remains alive and not go the way of the American dream?
I think the one good thing about having an American dream, even if it's part mythical, is the fact that Americans have had this dream since the creation of America, and it's still a valid aspiration for them today, even though they're a rich country. The danger is that most Asian societies have had dreams, but have never been sort of stated in any positive way. So the big question now today, let's say China, is Chinese people have always had a dream. They've never just enunciated and sort of put it formally in a mythical way that the Americans have. But the big question for China today is, now what? What is the Chinese dream? Americans have validly, there's still their own American dream, flawed, somewhat maybe battered around the edges, but it's still a valid dream for a young American person today, or a young person from outside America, after Trump maybe, to still be an immigrant and have dreams. In China today, if you're a young person, like in Hong Kong, what do you dream for? And that's the biggest question mark that Chinese society and the government has to do. Now that China has been, by and large, lifted out of poverty, now that you've got a strong middle class, what can they aspire to? Not simply more crass material wealth, which is what most of them are aspiring for today, and that is devoid of any kind of idealistic element, which at least American dream has. So I think that's the very negative side about Asian economic development. We've never had an enunciated dream. We're now at a middle class level. Where do we go besides crass wealth? And look at Hong Kong society. They've never had this cohesion to be able to develop a dream for themselves. In China, is it just to make China great again? That's not really, much of a dream beyond just coming out of national humiliation. Then what do you do? So that's the real challenge for Asia today, I think.
Helen?
Well, I remember a conversation with a think tank in Shanghai about 18 years ago, and the question we as New Zealanders put was, what are the aspirations of a Shanghai middle-class family today? And the answer came back, they want their own home, they want their own car, they want to be able to travel, and they will spend as much as they can on their children's education. This is 18 years ago. But I think you rightly make the point is, what now? What next? And the issue for me, and I have no particular view on it, is whether, as in the Western world, there's a point at which economic security starts to lead to other demands for voice and freedom of expression. That's the big issue, and how then that is accommodated in these quite authoritarian systems.
I mean, I agree with.
You can't keep agreeing with KP.
No, this is a love fest.
But watch out, there may be a sting in the tail there. No, I agree with KP that these are the big questions now. Okay, you achieve a certain degree of material prosperity, a certain degree of well-being. Where do you go from now? And of course, the traditional Western assumption about China is that what China will do, of course, quite naturally, is that it develops the world's largest middle class. It will automatically then become a liberal democracy, and then China would have arrived. Now, it's very clear, at least for the next 10, 20 years, that China is not going to become a liberal democracy anytime soon. It's going to take its own road. But even on its own road, it's got to decide, as KP said, what are you striving to achieve or build on? And my sense, is that the Chinese advantage is that they have one of the deepest and richest wells of history of any civilization. And the Chinese civilization over the last 2,000 years, what makes it unique is they're one of these big civilizations that has fallen, stood up, fallen, stood up, fallen, stood up. Amazing. There's a kind of resilience there. And I think what's going to happen in China, and you see it already, in a sense, as you get enough material well-being, they're going to dive into their rich history and have some kind of a cultural renaissance of the sort that I think Europe enjoyed, as you know. So that's what I think is coming. And if you want a kind of very small leading indicator of that, if you want a market signal of that, look at the price of Chinese antiques, right? Amazing, it's going like this. Why? The Chinese people want to reconnect almost physically with what was their great past. So in that sense, I suspect that if you are a young Chinese, there's a certain degree of excitement about the future, which paradoxically is based on a rich past.
But if I may, I think the irony here is that China is delving very much into its rich past of falling and rising again. And the Chinese Communist Party is well aware that China's history and success is not rooted in liberal democracy, nor in allowing individual human rights. Chinese failure, or the success or failure of Chinese dynasties have been political accountability. And once you lose that accountability, and emperors in China never had liberal democracy, but they were as accountable to the people as anyone else. And when there's no more accountability, when you cannot, as an average Chinese person, having now achieved middle classdom, not necessarily wanting to be a political dissident and bringing human rights, when you've bought enough Louis Vuitton bags, What do you aspire for? That's probably closer then to the American dream of being an entrepreneur, being able to do something of your own and not being blocked. And when you are blocked by corrupt officials, or you see your competitor is corrupt and is able to stop you, and so on, I think that's when people will increasingly realize that the mandate of heaven for the Communist Party has fallen. And drawing on history, that's when the Chinese people, regardless of whether there is authoritarianism or not, will rise and overthrow their governments. Chinese history is nothing but one of dynasties who had no divine claim, as European history had, no divine claim to governance, except that they were able to provide better accountability for the people.
So outside of China, how do you see the Asian dream evolving? If you take the case of Singapore, which some say is a supersized vision of the Asian dream, it's changed. I mean, 5-10 years ago, it was the pursuit of the 5 C's, the credit card, the car, the condo, the cash, and I think it's a country club. Nobody talks about the 5 C's anymore. How do you see the Asian dream evolving outside of China?
Let me quickly give you the answer, my answer for Singapore, okay? You know, in the 19th century was the European century. That century needed a capital. It was London. The 20th century was the American century. It needed a capital. It was New York. The 21st century is the Asian century. It needs a capital. It will be Singapore.
Hang on, KB. Jiatri, your vision of how the Asian dream will evolve. We have 3 minutes, so I'm going to go down the line.
Well, no, it's what Kishore was saying. I mean, the access to capital has really redefined all of Asia and the sense of hope and meritocracy. I've never seen it before. You've always had this sense of a stratified society across Asia, and this is the very first time in history where you actually have stories and these stories of entrepreneurship, you know, of young 25-year-olds, you know, making a big impact, that spreads and that creates even more hope. And so I'm a big optimist that the Asian dream is you know, very healthy and well on its way. But I also wouldn't disagree with KP in the sense that the governments have done a great job here in Asia in taking care of the lower class, but also, you know, adopting this culture of innovation and spreading it and encouraging, you know, entrepreneurship.
KP, the evolution of the Asian dream?
No, I think, in my view, all dreams, Asian, American, Chinese, whatever, they are inherent, they're instinctive, they're part of what every human being has. So instead of wasting time, in my view, talking about what constitutes American or Chinese dream, I think a lot better time would be spent by all of us, including policymakers, looking at what might stymie the achievement of our own people's intrinsic dreams. Now, you talked about Singapore, the 5 C's and so on. I don't particularly want to redefine the Singapore dream. I don't think a young Singaporean today versus myself when I was much younger have any difference in dreams. We want better lives for ourselves. The right question to ask is, in Singapore today, are there potential obstacles to a younger person achieving that dream? And there are. We've been well known for being a meritocratic society, but all of us, including our policymakers, recognize today that we have structural meritocracy, but we do not have much dynamic meritocracy. Now, much of what happens today is whether you've gone to the right schools. When you've gone to the right schools, you can come out of the right universities, and there is now beginning in Singapore a self-perpetuating elite, not a self-perpetuating elite by virtue of what they were before. And the government is well aware of that, and well aware that we need to try to change that, because otherwise a culture of egalitarianism will begin to decline in Singapore. And we, like in New Zealand, I think are proud to say that a culture of egalitarianism, not necessarily the reality of total equality, but a culture of egalitarianism is critical to our society's survival. And the culture of egalitarianism has been very much the key to American success. And when that culture begins to erode and people don't feel the society is egalitarian anymore, then you have the beginning of the dissolution of the social fabric. And that's what I'm afraid of in Singapore. And the government's well aware of that, and we're all trying to change that.
2 last points. One, of course, not every country in Asia has won the war against poverty. There is still unfinished business in the region. And the second point, the way in which the war against poverty has been won in Asia and in the West, if I can put it that way, has been at an incredible price to the environment. And we're now at the point where that price stands to roll back human development gains. And that's another whole conversation about planetary health and the implications of that. But that is one of the constraints on sustaining and lifting human development further.
It's been a heated discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists today, Helen Clark, Ho Pompey, Hisham Abubani, Chadwick Sidgaton. Thank you.
Great class.